"It's just the two of us and it's cold in here. We have no choice but," said the shaking woman. She hugged her arms tightly around herself, trying to hold on to any warmth she could find. The car they had been driving for hours now sat stranded on a narrow, snow-covered road. Outside, everything was white. The storm had come suddenly, like it had appeared from nowhere, and now the world around them seemed frozen and silent, except for the whistling of the wind and the crunch of snow under the tires. Amina's younger brother, Omar, sat beside her in the passenger seat, rubbing his hands together, trying to stay warm. His breath came in small, visible clouds, and his small fingers were turning red from the cold. He looked at his sister, eyes wide, and whispered, "Amina, what are we going to do?" Amina swallowed hard, her throat dry. She had been trying to stay strong, to show Omar that she could take care of him, but fear was creeping in despite her best efforts. She could feel the cold biting through her jacket, making her teeth chatter uncontrollably. She leaned closer to Omar and said, her voice trembling, "It's just the two of us, and it's cold in here. We have no choice but to stay calm and think carefully." Omar nodded slowly, but she could see the worry in his eyes. He was only 12 years old, and this was far beyond anything he had ever faced before. He had trusted his sister to keep him safe, and now, in the middle of a snowstorm, that responsibility weighed heavily on her. She took a deep breath and tried to focus on the practical steps they could take to survive the night. The storm had started while they were driving back from visiting relatives in a small village. The sun had been shining earlier that day, making the road easy to navigate. But as the afternoon passed, clouds rolled in quickly and snow began to fall. At first, it was just a light dusting, but within an hour the snow was thick, heavy, and relentless. The road became slippery and invisible, making it impossible to see the edges. Amina had slowed down, but even at a safe speed, the car eventually slid onto a patch of ice and came to a stop near the side of the road. They had tried to move again, but the tires spun uselessly, and the car refused to budge. Now, trapped in the car, Amina and Omar faced the harsh reality that help might not come immediately. Mobile signals were weak, and the village they had just left was several miles away. The only sound was the storm's howl and the occasional crack of ice from the nearby trees. Amina's mind raced. She had read about survival situations before, but nothing could truly prepare her for the fear that comes with being alone in a cold, empty wilderness. She glanced at Omar again and tried to force a smile. "Remember what I told you," she said. "We have to stay calm, we have to stay together. That's how we'll get through this." Omar nodded again, this time with a faint attempt at a smile, though his lips were chapped and his face red from the cold. He clutched a small blanket they had brought from the car and tried to wrap it around himself, but it was too thin to provide much warmth. Amina knew they had to do something, but she also knew that panicking would make the situation worse. She took out the small thermos of tea they had packed for the journey. It was lukewarm at best, but she poured some into 2 cups and handed one to Omar. "Here," she said, "it's not much, but it will help a little." Omar took the cup with both hands and sipped slowly, grimacing at the taste. The warmth was small, but it helped him feel a little better. Amina took a sip herself and felt the liquid spread through her chest, giving her a brief sense of comfort. For a few minutes they sat in silence, listening to the storm outside. Hours seemed to stretch endlessly. The wind continued to howl, and the snow piled up around the car. Amina tried to think of every possible option. She remembered that in survival situations, it was important to conserve energy and keep warm. She suggested to Omar that they huddle together under the blanket, using their combined body heat to stay warmer. They wrapped themselves as best as they could, and for a while the closeness helped stave off the cold. As the evening grew darker, the storm showed no sign of slowing. Amina knew that they could not stay in the car forever. She looked outside through the frost-covered window and saw nothing but white. Every tree looked the same, and the path they had taken was completely covered by snow. The realization sank in. If they wanted to survive, they would need to find shelter. But the thought of venturing into the storm filled her with fear. The cold was already painful and the wind threatened to push them off balance. Amina's mind raced with questions. Where could they go? How far was the nearest cabin or house? Would they be able to make it without frostbite or exhaustion? Despite her fear, she knew she had to appear strong for Omar. She took his hand and squeezed it gently. "We'll figure this out," she said, trying to sound confident, even though her own heart was pounding. "We just have to be careful and stay together. We can do this." Omar looked at her and nodded, trusting her words. The siblings shared a quiet moment of connection, drawing strength from each other. They began to talk about lighter things to distract themselves from the storm. They reminisced about their trip to the village earlier that day, laughing softly about the silly things they had seen and the jokes they had shared. It was a small comfort, but it reminded them that the world outside the storm still existed and that they were not entirely alone. As night fell, the temperature dropped even further. Frost formed on the inside of the car windows, and their fingers and toes felt numb despite the blankets and jackets. Amina realized that they needed a plan. Waiting passively for the storm to pass could be dangerous. She remembered a faint trail they had seen earlier that might lead to a small cabin not far from the road. It was risky, but staying in the car indefinitely might be even more dangerous. Amina began to prepare mentally for what they would need to do. She checked the car for anything that could help: a flashlight with weak batteries, the remaining tea in the thermos, and a few pieces of dry clothing in the trunk. She bundled them together into a small backpack, careful not to waste energy. Omar watched her movements silently, learning from her careful, deliberate actions. Finally, after hours of waiting and planning, Amina made the decision. "Omar," she whispered, "we are going to try to find shelter. We have to move carefully, but we can do this together. I will lead the way and we will stay close. No matter what, we stay together." Omar's eyes widened and he shivered, not just from the cold but also from fear. "Are you sure we can make it?" he asked softly. Amina nodded, though uncertainty lingered in her own mind. "We have to try. We don't have another choice. But we will take it slow, step by step, and we will watch out for each other. We will be okay." She helped Omar out of the car, wrapping him in the blanket and making sure his jacket was secure. The wind hit them immediately, fierce and unrelenting, but they moved carefully, one step at a time. The snow crunched under their boots, and the world outside seemed endless, white, and frightening. Every movement was exhausting, and the cold seemed to seep into their very bones. Yet, despite the fear and the pain, they kept moving forward. They remembered small survival tips they had learned in school and online. Keep your body moving to stay warm, conserve energy, and never separate from your partner. Amina led the way slowly, scanning the horizon for any sign of a path or shelter. Omar followed closely, trusting her guidance and sometimes looking up at her for reassurance. They shared quiet words of encouragement, holding onto hope with every step. Hours felt like days and the storm raged on. Their bodies ached, their fingers and toes were numb, and the darkness of the night pressed down on them. Yet, in the middle of this fear, there was a bond growing stronger than ever before. The shared struggle, the need to protect each other, and the constant conversation kept their spirits alive. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, a faint outline appeared in the distance, the shape of a small cabin. Relief surged through Amina, and she called to Omar, pointing to the faint light through the snow. They hurried as best as they could, their exhaustion pushing them to move faster despite the cold. When they reached the cabin, it was small and abandoned, but it offered the first real shelter they had seen since the storm began. Amina pushed open the creaking door, and they stepped inside, grateful for the break from the wind. The cabin was cold, damp, and dark, but it was a haven compared to the blizzard outside. They huddled together, wrapping the blanket around themselves and sitting close to conserve warmth. Their faces were pale, their hands stiff, but their hearts were full of relief. For the first time that night, Amina allowed herself to exhale fully. They had survived the initial terror, and though the journey was far from over, they had each other. And that, she realized, was the most important thing. No matter how cold it was, no matter how long the night, they would face it together. And together, they would find a way to survive. Amina and Omar huddled together in the small, abandoned cabin, listening to the wind howl outside. The storm still raged, rattling the wooden walls and shaking the windows. Inside, the air was cold and damp, but it was still far better than the merciless blizzard outside. They wrapped the thin blanket tightly around their shoulders, sharing what little warmth they could. Amina took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. The events of the past hours replayed in her mind: the car sliding on ice, the endless snow, the feeling of being trapped in a frozen world with no one to help. She looked at Omar, who was sitting silently with wide, anxious eyes. He was exhausted, shivering uncontrollably, and every breath he took made little clouds in the frigid air. She could see how frightened he was, and it made her determination grow. She had to keep him safe, not just for now, but for the long night ahead. "We need to stay calm, Omar," she said softly. "Panic won't help us. We have to think carefully and plan." Omar nodded, his lips chapped and pale. "But what do we do, Amina? It's so cold, and I don't know how long we can stay here." Amina smiled faintly, trying to hide her own fear. "We'll manage. We'll find ways to stay warm, and we'll take care of each other. That's the most important thing. Together, we're stronger than the storm." The siblings began to explore the small cabin cautiously. It was empty except for a broken table, a couple of old chairs, and a fireplace filled with cold ashes. The wood in the fireplace looked damp and useless, but Amina carefully examined it. If they could find some dry pieces hidden among the rubble, maybe they could start a fire. She also checked the windows, closing any that were slightly open to block the wind from seeping in. Every little action felt crucial, and she could see Omar watching her closely, learning from each decision she made. After some searching, Amina found a few dry twigs and pieces of wood hidden under a pile of leaves in the corner. She carefully stacked them in the fireplace, hoping they would catch a spark. She had remembered from a camping trip long ago how to make a small fire using just a match, but the wind had dampened most of the wood. She worked patiently, teaching Omar how to arrange the sticks and small branches so the fire could burn better once lit. Omar helped as best as he could, though his hands were numb and trembling. Amina wrapped his fingers around hers to warm them as she guided him. "We have to be patient," she said. "One small spark can make a big difference. We just have to keep trying." Finally, after several attempts, a small flame flickered to life. The warmth it gave was minimal at first, but it was enough to lift their spirits. They huddled closer to it, feeling a little of the cold melt away. Amina poured the rest of their lukewarm tea into 2 cups, letting the heat from the fire warm the liquid slightly. They drank slowly, savoring the warmth and the comfort it brought. For a few moments, they could almost forget the storm outside. As the hours passed, Amina and Omar focused on staying warm and conserving energy. They huddled together under the blanket, sharing stories from their past to distract themselves from the cold. Amina told Omar about the time they had built a small fort in their backyard during summer and pretended it was a castle. Omar laughed softly, the sound breaking the oppressive silence of the cabin. He began to relax a little, realizing that even in the darkest moments, there was still room for hope and memory. Amina knew they could not rely solely on warmth and stories. They needed a plan for survival if the storm continued. She carefully rationed the tea, making sure they had enough to last until they could find more water. She encouraged Omar to eat small snacks they had packed in the car, even though it was difficult to keep their fingers warm enough to open the wrappers. Every small act of preparation gave them a sense of control in a situation that felt overwhelmingly dangerous. The night dragged on, and the storm outside showed no signs of slowing. Amina noticed the frost forming on the edges of the windows, and she could see how exhausted Omar was becoming. His movements were slow, and his teeth chattered uncontrollably. She knew that keeping his spirits up was just as important as keeping him warm. "We're doing great," she whispered. "Every hour we stay safe is a victory. Look at how far we've come already. We survived the storm outside and made it here. That's not easy." Omar's eyes flickered with a mixture of exhaustion and relief. He leaned his head against Amina's shoulder, feeling safer with her clothes. She hugged him tightly, feeling a surge of protectiveness and love. It was in these moments she realized that true strength was needed, not the kind that comes from physical ability, but the kind that comes from care, courage, and determination. As they rested near the small fire, Amina began to plan their next steps. She knew they could not stay in the cabin forever. The storm might last through the night, and food and water were limited. They would need to venture outside eventually, perhaps to find a better shelter or signal for help. But for now, survival meant conserving energy and keeping spirits alive. She spoke softly to Omar about what they would do in the morning, giving him small tasks to focus on. "Tomorrow, we'll check the area carefully," she said. "We'll look for any nearby houses or signs of help. But we must move slowly and carefully. Safety comes first. For now, let's rest and regain some strength." Omar nodded, understanding the importance of planning and patience. The trust between the siblings grew stronger with every passing hour. He realized that Amina's calmness, even in fear, was what allowed them to survive this far. Her presence was a lifeline in the freezing darkness, and he clung to it with quiet gratitude. Hours turned into the early morning, and the storm finally began to show faint signs of slowing. The wind remained strong, but the snow outside was less chaotic than before. Amina looked out through a small gap in the frosted window, trying to assess the world beyond. She could see the outlines of trees, heavy with snow, and the faint curve of the road they had traveled. The sight reminded her of the long journey still ahead, but also gave her hope that the storm would eventually pass and they could find help. Despite the slight improvement, the cold continued to press on them. Their blankets were thin, their clothing was damp, and their bodies were still stiff from hours of exposure. Amina encouraged Omar to move slowly, stretch his fingers, and sip more tea to maintain some warmth. Every action was small, but together they made a difference. Throughout the night, they talked more about their memories and dreams. Omar shared his hopes of returning to school soon and playing with friends again. Amina reminded him of their favorite stories from childhood and the adventures they had shared during summers. The conversation was a way to keep fear at bay, to maintain their mental strength when the physical challenges were overwhelming. As the sun began to rise, a pale light filtered through the cabin's window. The world outside remained white and cold, but there was a sense of calm after the chaos of the storm. Amina felt a surge of relief mixed with determination. The storm had tested them, but they had survived the night together. She knew that the challenges were far from over, but the bond between them, their resilience, and the careful planning they had undertaken gave her confidence. She turned to Omar and said, "We made it through the worst of the night. Look, the sun is coming up. That means the storm is ending and we have a chance to move forward. We did it together and together we'll keep going." Omar smiled weakly, the exhaustion still visible on his face but tempered by hope. "I'm glad you're here, Amina," he whispered. Amina hugged him tightly. "And I'm glad you're here too. We'll face whatever comes next, step by step. We'll be okay, I promise." The siblings spent a few more moments in quiet reflection, appreciating the small victory of surviving the night. The cabin, though cold and abandoned, had provided the sanctuary they needed to regain strength. They had learned that survival required patience, careful planning, emotional resilience, and the support of loved ones. Each small action, sharing warmth, rationing tea, keeping spirits up, had made a real difference. Finally, Amina stood, stretched carefully, and looked outside. The storm was receding, and the road ahead, though still covered in snow, seemed slightly more navigable. She began to think about the next steps, finding additional shelter, ensuring they had enough food and water, and eventually returning to safety. She knew the journey would be difficult, but she felt ready to face it because they had faced the night together and survived. Omar followed her, leaning on her support as they prepared to step back into the cold world outside. The cabin had been a refuge, but survival required movement and action. Amina took a deep breath, feeling the strength that comes from caring for someone you love. She held Omar's hand tightly and whispered, "Let's keep going carefully together. We can do this." With that, the two siblings stepped toward the snow-covered world beyond the cabin, ready to face the challenges ahead with courage, hope, and determination, knowing that as long as they stayed together, they could endure anything. The morning light filtered weakly through the snow-covered branches outside, creating long, pale shadows on the icy ground. Amina and Omar stepped carefully out of the cabin, their boots crunching loudly on the hardened snow. The storm had lessened, but the world was still blanketed in white, making every familiar landmark unrecognizable. Trees bowed under the weight of snow, and the road they had followed yesterday had vanished completely beneath a thick, slippery layer. The cold was still biting, and every breath they drew seemed to crystallize in the frigid air. Amina tightened her scarf around her neck and pulled her coat closer. Omar shuffled beside her, trying to keep pace despite the stiffness in his legs and the numbness in his toes. "Stay close to me," Amina reminded him softly, "and watch your step. The snow can hide holes, ice, or weak ground. One wrong move can be dangerous." Omar nodded, his eyes scanning the landscape warily. He was beginning to understand that survival wasn't just about warmth, it was about careful movement, awareness, and patience. Each step felt heavy, each breath a challenge, but the siblings pressed on, encouraged by the small victories of the night before. As they trudged through the snow, Amina tried to recall anything from the few survival guides she had read. She remembered that it was important to keep moving, but also to take breaks to avoid overexertion in the cold. Her first plan was to find higher ground, which could give them a clearer view of the surrounding area. Perhaps they could spot a road, a house, or some sign of life. The snow made every step exhausting. They sank ankle-deep, sometimes knee-deep, and their boots were beginning to feel wet. The wind was calmer than last night, but every gust still carried a sharp bite. Amina held Omar's hand tightly, guiding him over treacherous patches and warning him when the snow concealed hidden obstacles. He clung to her hand, trusting her judgment completely, his small fingers almost numb but never letting go. Hours passed as they moved slowly and deliberately. The forest seemed endless, and fatigue began to creep into their muscles. Amina noticed that Omar's movements were becoming sluggish, and his shivering had intensified. She stopped for a moment, crouched down, and pressed her gloved hands to his cheeks. "You're doing well," she said gently. "I know it's hard, but we're getting closer to help. Let's take a short break, warm our hands, and drink some water." They pulled out a small thermos from the backpack, carefully avoiding spilling the tiny amount of remaining tea. It was lukewarm at best, but it gave them a brief sense of comfort and energy. Amina reminded Omar to drink slowly, knowing that hydration was essential even in the cold. They shared a few bites of dry bread they had saved from the car, chewing silently as their bodies absorbed what little nourishment they had. Resting for a few minutes, Amina scanned the horizon. The trees, heavy with snow, blocked much of her view, but she could make out a faint line of something that looked like smoke in the distance. She squinted, unsure if it was real or just a trick of her eyes in the pale morning light. Her heart leapt at the thought of human presence. If it was smoke, it could mean a house, a cabin, or even a small village. "Omar," she whispered, "look over there. Do you see that faint smoke in the distance? It might mean someone is nearby." Omar's eyes widened, a flicker of hope lighting his tired face. "Do you think it's real?" he asked. "I'm not sure, but we won't know unless we move carefully toward it," Amina said. "We have to be careful, though. The snow can be tricky, and we need to avoid getting lost or slipping." The siblings pressed on, using the potential smoke as a guide. Their pace was slow and cautious, but every step brought them a little closer to hope. The snow seemed to stretch endlessly, making it easy to lose track of direction. Amina kept reminding herself to stay focused, checking landmarks they had passed, making mental notes of each turn, and ensuring that Omar stayed close. As they moved, Amina also noticed signs of the storm's power. Broken branches lay across their path, and some trees had fallen entirely, blocking potential routes. The snow had formed deep drifts in places, creating dangerous pockets where they could sink unexpectedly. Amina carefully tested the ground with a long branch before stepping forward, guiding Omar to follow her example. Despite the physical challenges, the journey was also mentally exhausting. Each step required attention, courage, and careful planning. Omar occasionally faltered, his small legs straining to keep up. Amina would crouch beside him, whispering encouragement and offering her hand to steady him. "One step at a time," she said repeatedly. "We're doing this together and we won't stop until we're safe." By midday, their progress had brought them closer to what appeared to be a small clearing. The snow here was slightly shallower, and the wind was less intense, giving them a moment of respite. They took another short break, huddling together under a few low branches that offered minimal shelter. Omar's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and his fingers were stiff and pale. Amina pressed her hands against his face again, rubbing warmth into him. "We're doing well," she said. "The smoke, if it's real, is still ahead. That means people or at least shelter. We just have to keep going carefully." Omar nodded, though he shivered violently. "I'm scared, Amina," he admitted. "I know," she said softly. "I'm scared too. But we can do this. Fear is normal. It helps us pay attention and stay safe, but we can't let it stop us." After a short rest, they resumed their journey. The clearing allowed them to see a little farther, and soon Amina spotted the faint outline of a cabin through the trees, with a thin wisp of smoke curling from its chimney. Relief surged through her, and she called to Omar softly, pointing toward the cabin. "There it is, Omar. Look, smoke, people might be there, we're getting closer." Omar's face lit up with a small smile despite his exhaustion. "Really? That means help," he whispered. Amina nodded. "It's a good sign. We have to be careful as we approach, but we're not alone anymore." They moved more carefully now, aware that the last stretch could be dangerous. The snow was uneven, with hidden ice patches and deep drifts. Amina used her branch to test the ground ahead, and Omar followed her lead. Step by step, they advanced, the cabin growing larger and more visible with each movement. When they finally reached the clearing, they could see the cabin clearly. It was small but sturdy, made of logs and partially insulated by the snow around it. Smoke rose gently from the chimney, a sign that someone was inside and that warmth awaited them. Amina's heart pounded with relief, but she reminded herself to remain cautious. They did not know who lived here, and she wanted to make sure it was safe for them to enter. She approached the door slowly, tapping gently before calling out. "Hello, is anyone here? Please, we need help." The door creaked open, and a middle-aged woman appeared, her face lined with concern. "Oh my goodness, you're frozen." "Come inside quickly," she exclaimed, opening the door wider and letting them enter. Amina helped Omar inside, and the woman guided them to a small fireplace that was already burning. Warmth instantly enveloped them, and the siblings could feel the tension in their bodies begin to ease. Amina carefully removed Omar's wet boots and coat, wrapping him in thick blankets. The woman offered hot tea and a bowl of warm soup, which they accepted gratefully. As they sipped the tea, Amina and Omar finally felt a sense of safety that had eluded them since the storm began. The cabin, once distant and unknown, was now a refuge where they could rest, regain strength, and plan the next steps. Amina looked at Omar and smiled gently. See, step by step, we stayed together, we stayed careful, and now we're safe. That's what matters. Omar leaned against her, feeling the warmth for the first time in what seemed like hours. Thank you, Amina, he whispered. I was so scared, but you kept me safe. Amina hugged him tightly, feeling a mixture of relief and pride. We kept each other safe. That's the important part. And we're not done yet, but we'll face what comes next together. As the afternoon light faded, the storm finally passed completely. Outside, the world was still white and cold, but no longer threatening. Amina and Omar rested by the fire, warmed by the cabin, and comforted by the presence of someone willing to help. They had faced fear, cold, and exhaustion, and they had survived together. Amina knew that the journey ahead would still be challenging. They needed to contact their family, return home, and ensure they could travel safely in the aftermath of the storm. But for the first time in many hours, hope replaced fear. They had survived one of the hardest parts, navigating the storm and finding shelter. Their bond had grown stronger, their courage deeper, and their trust in each other unwavering. As the siblings rested, Amina reflected on the lessons of the past day. Careful planning, staying close, maintaining hope, and taking each step with thoughtfulness could turn even the most frightening situation into one they could endure. She held Omar's hand, and together they watched the fire, feeling a warmth that went beyond the physical. It was the warmth of survival, family, and the certainty that together they could face anything. The warmth from the cabin's small fireplace seemed like a miracle after the endless cold and harsh snow. Amina and Omar sat close together, wrapped in blankets, sipping the hot tea offered by the kind woman who had opened the door to them. Their bodies still trembled from the cold, but inside, the feeling of safety allowed their minds to rest, if only for a short while. For the first time since the storm had trapped them, they could breathe without fear pressing heavily on their chest. Amina looked around the cabin. It was small, rustic, and simple, but it had everything they needed to survive for the moment. A roof over their heads, firewood, and even a few supplies left behind by the woman. She was grateful, but her mind was already thinking about the next challenges. Food and water were limited, and the storm had left the roads impassable. They could not stay in this cabin indefinitely. They had survived the storm, but survival would now depend on their careful planning, patience, and teamwork. Omar, Amina said softly, we have to be careful and take care of our energy. We can't overdo it, but we also need to plan what to do next. Rest now, eat, and get warm. Later, we'll figure out the next steps. Omar nodded, his small hands clutching the blanket. His teeth still chattered slightly, but he had begun to relax, the warmth easing the stiffness in his limbs. I'm glad we're here, Amina, he whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you. Amina smiled faintly, brushing a strand of hair from his face. We kept each other safe, Omar. That's what matters. And now we need to focus on staying strong. The storm is over, but we're not completely safe yet. The woman who had rescued them, noticing their exhaustion, brought out a small pile of dry firewood and helped replenish the fireplace. The flames roared higher, filling the cabin with heat and light. Amina took a deep breath, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen limbs. Omar did the same, letting out a quiet sigh of relief. They had survived, but the night ahead and the journey to return home were still uncertain. Once they had eaten a little and regained some warmth, Amina began to organize their small resources. She divided the remaining food into portions, carefully rationing each meal. She reminded Omar that they had to eat slowly to maintain energy, even if they were hungry. Water was another concern. They had melted some snow earlier for drinking, but that could only last for a short time. Amina realized they would need a plan to find clean water soon. "We'll need to check the area tomorrow," she explained to Omar. "We can look for more supplies or even try to find a road where someone might see us. But tonight, we rest. Our bodies need energy to think clearly and stay safe." Omar nodded again, feeling the weight of responsibility for their own survival even at his young age. He understood that Amina's careful planning was the key to their safety, and he trusted her completely. The cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a place where they could gather strength, think clearly, and prepare for the next challenge. As evening approached, the fire crackled and cast flickering shadows on the walls. Amina kept an eye on Omar, noticing that his shivering had lessened, but that he was still pale and weak. She gently massaged his hands and feet to restore some warmth and encouraged him to rest as much as possible. "The more rested you are, the better prepared we'll be for tomorrow," she said. "Sleep now if you can. I'll stay awake for a while and watch over us." Omar rested his head against her shoulder, closing his eyes. The exhaustion of the past hours finally caught up with him, and he began to drift into a light sleep. Amina stayed awake, reflecting on the storm, the frozen forest, and the moments that had brought them to this cabin. Every decision she had made, the careful steps through deep snow, the rationing of food and water, and the constant reassurance of Omar, had mattered. She realized that survival was as much about mental strength and emotional resilience as it was about physical endurance. The night was long. Outside, the wind had lessened but still whispered through the trees. Amina listened carefully, aware that the snow could shift, branches could break, and even small dangers could arise unexpectedly. She stayed close to the fire, keeping a watchful eye on the cabin and on Omar. Occasionally, she stirred the flames, watching as the firelight danced across the walls and warmed the small space. When morning came, the storm had completely passed. The world outside the cabin was still white, but calm. The sun shone faintly, reflecting off the snow and creating a soft glow that lit the forest. Amina woke Omar gently, helping him stretch and move to regain mobility in his stiff limbs. They ate a small breakfast, carefully rationed again, and prepared themselves to step outside and assess their surroundings. Amina led the way, checking the area around the cabin for any signs of danger or opportunity. The snow was still thick, but footprints from the cabin and nearby paths gave them clues about the world outside. She and Omar moved cautiously, each step deliberate, their eyes scanning for unstable ice, weak branches, or other hazards. As they explored, Amina noticed that the forest was quieter than it had been during the storm. The air was still cold, but the absence of wind made it easier to move. They discovered a small stream nearby, partially covered with ice but flowing enough to provide clean water. Amina carefully collected snow and ice to melt for drinking, ensuring they had enough to last while they planned their next move. Omar helped, learning how to gather and handle the ice without spilling or contaminating it. With water secured, Amina focused on scouting the area for possible paths to safety. She observed the forest carefully, noting landmarks and calculating the safest direction to travel. The snow made it difficult to see far, but small details, the slope of the land, the curve of the stream, the faint trail of footprints, helped her make decisions. Omar followed her closely, keeping his spirits up by asking questions and helping where he could. Hours passed as they moved slowly, carefully testing the snow and watching for obstacles. They found fallen trees, deep snow drifts, and patches of ice that could easily cause a slip or injury. Every step required attention, but Amina used the opportunity to teach Omar about the environment, how to judge snow depth, how to identify safe paths, and how to conserve energy while moving. By midday, they discovered a second, slightly larger cabin partially hidden in the forest. This cabin seemed unused for a while, but the structure was solid, and it offered more space to rest and regroup. Amina and Omar moved inside, grateful for another refuge. They found additional firewood left behind and used it to build a stronger fire, giving them more warmth and the ability to cook the small remaining food more effectively. The cabin also gave them a sense of stability. For the first time since the storm began, Amina allowed herself to relax slightly, knowing they were safe for the moment. She encouraged Omar to stretch, walk a little inside the cabin, and regain strength. She also took a moment to check her own body, making sure she stayed warm, dry, and hydrated. Every small detail mattered in their ongoing effort to survive. Even in the safety of the second cabin, Amina remained vigilant. She knew that survival required constant attention and planning. They reviewed their limited supplies, rationed food and water again, and made notes about their intended route to safety once the snow had lessened. She taught Omar to recognize potential signs of danger outside, weak branches, thin ice, and changes in the snow that could signal instability. Throughout the day, the siblings worked together, building their physical strength, reinforcing the fire, and keeping their spirits high. Amina reminded Omar that mental resilience was just as important as physical survival. They talked about their memories, shared small stories, and laughed softly at moments that reminded them of home. These moments of joy helped keep fear at bay and strengthen the bond between them. As evening approached, they prepared for another night in the cabin. Amina stoked the fire, arranged blankets, and made sure Omar was warm and comfortable. She also prepared a small amount of melted snow for drinking during the night, knowing that staying hydrated was crucial. They ate a small dinner, carefully rationed to last through the night and maintain their energy. Sitting by the fire, Amina reflected on the past 2 days. The storm had been relentless, but they had survived. Their careful planning, teamwork, and emotional support for each other had made the difference. She knew that the final challenge, finding help and returning to their family, was still ahead, but they were stronger and more prepared than ever. Omar leaned against her, feeling safe and comforted by her presence. "We can do this, right, Amina?" he whispered. Amina smiled, brushing his hair back. "Yes, Omar, together we can face anything. We've made it through the worst of the storm and we'll keep going, step by step, carefully together." The fire crackled softly, and the cold night pressed against the cabin walls, but inside, warmth and hope prevailed. They had survived the storm, and they would survive whatever came next, because they were together, cautious and determined. The sun rose slowly over the snow-covered forest, casting a soft, pale light across the frozen landscape. Amina and Omar had spent the night in the second cabin, warm for the first time since the storm began, but they knew that their journey was not over. They had survived the immediate dangers of the storm, but now they faced the challenge of returning to safety, finding their family, and ensuring that they could navigate the cold, treacherous world outside. Amina stirred first, shaking off the last remnants of sleep and checking on Omar. He was still curled under the blankets, his face pale but more relaxed than the previous nights. She gently shook his shoulder. "Omar, wake up. We need to get moving soon. The snow is firming up, and it's safer to travel now than later." Omar opened his eyes slowly, blinking against the dim light filtering through the small window. "Are we really ready to go?" he whispered, still wary from the past 2 days of fear and cold. "Yes," Amina replied, smiling gently. "We've rested, we're warm, and we have the supplies we need for the next part of our journey. We just need to be careful and move slowly. Together, we can do this." The siblings ate a small breakfast, rationing the last of their food and melting some snow for water. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and mindful of conserving energy. Amina checked their clothing, making sure layers were secure, scarves tight, and gloves dry. She gave Omar a reassuring smile. "Step by step," she whispered. "We'll get through this together." Outside, the world had transformed overnight. The storm had passed, leaving the forest quiet and still. Snow blanketed the ground, sparkling in the morning light, and the trees stood tall and white, their branches heavy but no longer swaying violently. Amina surveyed the landscape, plotting the safest route toward the nearest road or signs of civilization. She pointed to a faint trail that led through the trees. "We'll follow that path," she said. "It looks clear and it may lead to a road or house where someone can help us." Omar nodded, taking her hand. "I'll stay close to you," he promised. They set out slowly, each step requiring focus and effort. The snow, though packed in places, still made walking difficult, and their legs grew weary quickly. Amina led carefully, testing the ground with a sturdy branch before stepping forward and guiding Omar to follow her example. Every patch of ice or deep drift was a potential hazard, and she refused to rush. Survival had taught her that caution was more valuable than speed. As they walked, the siblings talked quietly to keep spirits high. Amina asked Omar to recall their memories from the past few days, to recount the small victories, the fire they had built, the shelters they had found, and the small meals that had sustained them. These conversations reminded them of their progress and reinforced their bond. Omar's fear began to fade gradually, replaced by cautious hope. Hours passed as they moved through the forest. The trail wound slowly, sometimes disappearing under fresh snow, but Amina remained vigilant. She noticed subtle signs of human activity, faint footprints, a disturbed patch of snow, and broken branches indicating previous passage. Each sign brought relief and motivation. The journey was still exhausting, but progress, no matter how small, fueled their determination. By midday, they spotted a faint glimmer in the distance, a cleared path with tire tracks likely leading to a road. Amina's heart leapt. "Omar, look, tracks. That means we're close to a road and maybe people who can help." Omar's face lit up with excitement. "Really? We might finally be safe?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. "Yes," Amina replied gently. "We just need to follow the tracks carefully. Step by step, and we'll get there." The final stretch of their journey was both thrilling and exhausting. The snow was deeper here, and fallen branches created obstacles that tested their stamina. Amina encouraged Omar to keep moving, praising each small step forward. "Look at you go," she said. "Every step brings us closer. You're doing amazing." Omar smiled faintly, feeling pride despite the fatigue. He relied on Amina's guidance completely, but he also began to realize that his own efforts mattered. Each careful movement, each mindful step, was part of their survival. The realization gave him a sense of empowerment that he had not felt before. After what felt like hours, they finally emerged from the forest onto a narrow, snow-covered road. Tire tracks were more visible here, and the world beyond the trees seemed familiar and safe. Amina scanned the horizon and saw a faint outline of a vehicle approaching. Relief surged through her chest. "Omar," she whispered, "look, a car. Someone is coming." The car drew closer, and a man inside spotted the two siblings. He slowed and stopped, opening the door as he called out to them. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" Amina and Omar ran toward the vehicle, exhaustion and relief mingling as they reached safety. The man quickly wrapped them in blankets and offered warm drinks. The siblings felt tears prick their eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming relief of finally being rescued. As the man drove them to the nearest village, Amina and Omar recounted the ordeal, describing the storm, the forest, and the small cabins that had saved them. Each story was a testament to their courage, resourcefulness, and the strength of their bond. The driver listened attentively, praising them for staying calm and working together. "You were very brave," he said. "Not many could have endured what you did." Amina looked at Omar, who was smiling now, exhausted but happy. "We did it together," she said softly. "That's what kept us alive." When they finally reached the village, their family was waiting anxiously. Tears and hugs were exchanged, and the siblings felt an overwhelming sense of relief and love. The warmth of home, combined with the comfort of family, was the final element of safety that had been missing during their ordeal. Over the following days, Amina and Omar rested, recovered, and shared their story with neighbors and friends. Their tale spread quickly through the community, inspiring others and reminding everyone of the power of resilience, teamwork, and courage. People praised the siblings for their careful planning, resourcefulness, and unwavering support for each other. Amina reflected on the experience quietly. The storm had tested her in ways she had never imagined. She had discovered courage she didn't know she had, patience she didn't realize she could muster, and a strength born from love and responsibility. The journey had been frightening, exhausting, and dangerous, but it had also revealed the depth of human resilience and the importance of never giving up. Omar, too, had grown. He realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. He had learned to trust himself, to rely on careful observation, and to stay calm under pressure. Most importantly, he had learned the value of family, teamwork, and shared responsibility. Together, the siblings understood that survival was not just about weathering the storm, but about how they faced it, together, with courage, patience, and hope. They had navigated fear, cold, and exhaustion, and had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united than ever. As the days passed, life slowly returned to normal. The snow melted, roads became clear, and the village resumed its quiet routine. But Amina and Omar carried with them the lessons of the storm, the importance of staying calm in crises, the value of careful planning, and the unbreakable bond of family. Even years later, they would remember the storm, not just for its danger, but for the courage, hope, and love that had guided them through it. The memory of the freezing nights, the deep snow, the cold cabins, and the endless forest would remain vivid, a reminder of what it meant to survive, to care for each other, and to never give up. Amina often thought back to the first night when she had whispered to Omar, "It's just the two of us and it's cold in here. We have no choice but." Those words had been both a warning and a promise. They had no choice but to rely on each other, to act with courage, and to face the unknown together. And that, she realized, had been the key to their survival. Omar, sitting beside her years later, often smiled and said, "We made it because you were there, Amina. You didn't let me give up." Amina would squeeze his hand and reply, "We made it because we stayed together, Omar. That's what always mattered." The story of their survival became part of the village's memory, a tale of courage, endurance, and hope. Neighbors often spoke of the siblings who faced a merciless storm and survived through teamwork, careful planning, and the unbreakable bond of family. Children learned from their story. Parents drew lessons about preparation and care, and the village celebrated the resilience of two young hearts who refused to give up, no matter how cold or frightening the world became. In the end, the siblings understood a truth that went beyond survival. Life would bring storms, challenges, and moments of fear, but the courage to face them, the patience to endure them, and the love to support each other would always provide a path forward. And as long as they stayed together, there was no challenge too great, no storm too fierce, and no obstacle too impossible. Amina and Omar had faced the worst the storm could throw at them. They had endured the cold, navigated the forest, survived hunger and exhaustion, and finally returned to warmth, safety, and family. Their journey had tested them in every way, but it had also shown them the power of courage, hope, and love. And that knowledge, they knew, would stay with them forever.